Hi, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. The war of savers versus speculators continues. Stacy Herbert.
And you know who continues to win, Max Keiser?
The speculators.
That's right. And why?
Because they get all the free money.
Because they're big babies and they screech and they tear apart our financial system, or they tear apart showrooms as they're doing in Shanghai if they don't get their way. So you could either politely protest around the world, or you can scream and shout and get your way. First headline here, Max: bank stocks ablaze. You know, we have a trillion something European-wide bailout, and the bankers were happy. Their shares soared.
Yes, the speculators, their ransom requirements were met. You know, this was all established in 2008, remember? When Hank Paulson put a gun to Congress's head and got almost $1 trillion from Congress to give Goldman Sachs and his buddies. Now they did the same thing in the Euro TARP. So this is moral hazard times moral hazard. It's moral hazard to the nth degree. And the worse you are at paying back your loans, the cheaper the interest rate gets and the more money you get. How do I get that deal? In other words, let me explain something, Stacy Herbert. If I were to throw up into a bucket of vomit, if I'm part of the top 1%, I can take that to the Fed and get $1 billion loan as collateral. But if I'm in the bottom 99%, all I've got is a bucket of spew.
Well, let's look at the bottom 99% in this next headline. A banner day for the 1% as bank stocks soar. This is a commentary from David Calloway on Dow Jones Market Watch, and he says, in one of the more bizarre twists of fate that only markets can bestow, the Occupy movement's burst to fame around the world this month has been accompanied by the biggest October for the Dow Jones Industrial Average in its 115-year history, up more than 11% as of this writing. So notice those words he uses there: bizarre twist of fate that only markets can bestow, when in fact it was heads of central banks around the world, heads of government around the world, heads of finance departments around the world who are in fact responsible for the booming stock market. It has nothing to do with the 1% creating wealth.
That's why I tell the Occupy Wall Street movement the only way to be taken seriously is to attack stock price. If the other side is going to point to a rising stock price and say, see, we're right, you're wrong, then the only answer to that is to take down a stock price, like Coca-Cola, for example, take it down to zero, knock out a $160 billion company. It's within everyone's ability to do so. Just stop drinking Coke. But I have a feeling that these Occupy Wall Street types, they like to talk all day, but when it comes to sacrifice, like not drinking a Coca-Cola product, they're not willing to make that sacrifice.
But, you know, again, the more important thing to look at here is the speculators and why they get their way. And they shriek and they shout and they say the world is ending. And the 99% who are trying to save or eking out a living, they're just being quiet and hoping to God that they can save their job. And that's the only thing they've got going. Meanwhile, the top 1% have trillions in debts, and they freak out and they scare the bejesus out of any single person that walks in their way. Dare they mention that it's all fraud and it's all puffery and imaginary wealth.
Yeah, well, this is where the Wall Street crowd has gone to school on the Pentagon. You know, the Pentagon is always worried about existential threat. We need another $5 trillion for some advanced weaponry. And same thing on Wall Street. They say, oh, there's an existential economic threat. We need high-frequency trading, algorithmic trading speeded up. So we need another bailout of $5 trillion. And they always use these imaginary threats to feed their pockets. And when they don't get their way, either they raise the red alert, as they do in Washington, to get their way, or they crash the market like they do on Wall Street to get their way.
Well, that's in the next headline. Europe's rescue euphoria threatened as Portugal enters Grecian vortex. Yes, you gave in to the speculator terrorists on Greece, and now they're going for Portugal. Monetary contraction in Portugal, we are told, has intensified at an alarming rate and is mimicking the pattern seen in Greece before its economy spiraled out of control. The Telegraph interviews Simon Ward of Henderson Financial, and he says the ECB must cut interest rates immediately and launch a full-scale blitz of quantitative easing of up to 10% of Eurozone GDP.
Well, this is the plan for the Eurozone. They're going to lever that up by trillions and trillions of euros and try to completely debase the euro because, as our friend talks about, it's a currency war where currency debasement is the goal. And now the Eurozone has gotten away from all of the Bundesbank concerns about having a sound unit of currency.
Yeah, no central bank cares at all about that, Max, in a fiat currency world. They pretend that we're the responsible ones in the room, we're the Bundesbank, and really we're keeping everybody else honest.
But do Germans now know that Merkel has fallen in with the financial terrorists? And
of course they do.
They realize that they're going to lose their sovereignty to the IMF too?
Yes,
I mean, the Germans are like,
everybody
okay,
knows that.
Greek, they lose their sovereignty. We don't care. We just go there to get drunk. Oh, Italy, we just buy our shoes there. We don't care if they lose their sovereignty. But do the German people now realize that they're about to lose their sovereignty to the IMF? How do they feel about that? Are you going to give up the ghost, German people?
Tell me one population that hasn't.
Iceland stood up to the banking terrorists.
No, we're speaking to Birgitta Jonsdottir next week, and she says, in fact, it's the opposite. So
Iceland too? Not even electing a lesbian to run your country saved you. My God.
So let's look at how the other speculators operate, and we see that the Chinese are learning very well. They're very smart. They mimic very well, by the way. That's how their education system is all rote learning. Now look at how they're rote learning from the West, how they are seeing who the power lies with. Shanghai homeowners smash showroom in protest over falling prices. A group of about 400 homeowners in Shanghai demonstrated publicly and damaged a showroom operated by their property developer after the company said it cut prices. Apparently, they cut the prices by 25% because new buyers were showing up. And one of the protesters is quoted as saying, "We require a refund because the loss we are suffering now is too great for us to afford." So how is that not the same as Hank Paulson? They looked at Hank Paulson, they said, that guy is a genius. He goes, I need a refund. I require a refund for all these bogus derivatives I at Goldman Sachs dumped onto the population.
What about the Teamsters? Goldman Sachs lost money in their pension fund, and only by threatening physical violence were they able to get that money back.
Yeah, but again, on that one small thing, yes, they perhaps won. But Jibo rocks on. Here's a video, another remix sent to us. You might like it. Is this what you see as a Jibo global insurrection against banker occupation? Jibo? Gaibo? Is this what you see as a Jibo global insurrection against banker occupation? Jibo? Gaibo?
Yeah, those remixes are nice. I like them. Keep them coming.
Well, so let's look at the side of the savers now. Let's see at the few headlines coming from the savers. Judge challenges $285 million Citigroup settlement. This is Judge Jed Rakoff in Manhattan, and he's challenged lawyers to explain why he should approve a settlement of serious securities fraud allegations when Citigroup Incorporated neither admits nor denies wrongdoing. So remember last week we covered this story where Citigroup settled a $1 billion fraud. They settled this fraud for $285 million, of which $95 million is the fine, right, with the SEC.
And I remember we had the conversation. We're saying that, how do they get away with this idea where they don't have to admit fraud, they just pay a fine after committing fraud?
So Judge Rakoff asks, how can a securities fraud of this nature and magnitude be the result simply of negligence? And he also asks, why Citigroup shareholders, not the individual executives responsible for the alleged fraud, are required to pay. So once again, this is the savers versus speculators. The savers take it. They're quiet, they're obedient. And here we have the savers behind the wave of Citigroup speculators who were all involved in the fraud. Because remember, Bernie Madoff was able to defraud people of $60 billion because they all knew, most of his investors knew he was a fraudster, but they assumed that they were gaining from it, that he was just front running based on his insider knowledge. The same thing is, here's the shareholders just quietly saying, okay, we'll obediently pay this $285 million fine because we know that there's probably far worse that they've stolen on our behalf, and as long as we'll just pay this little fine and move on.
Right, the shareholders of Citigroup have no expectation in the U.S. economy that fraud would be penalized at any time, so they never give it a second thought. even though they know that banks committing fraud. They don't see anyone using the law to stop any of these banks from committing fraud. So why should they be the ones to stand up and say, we don't want you committing fraud, when it obviously is the accepted modus operandi of the entire industry? The industry is based on fraud.
Yes. And now here you have the third largest bank in America, Citigroup, involved in this SEC decision where they get to just pay this fine and not admit to any guilt. Now look at how the bottom 99% are treated. 11 charged $1 billion U.S. railroad health scam. So 11 people were charged last week in a $1 billion fraud where employees of a busy New York commuter rail service used fake medical diagnoses to boost their incomes with disability payouts. These are union members on the Long Island Railroad, and they faced 20 years in prison for this $1 billion fraud.
Yeah. That's their penalty for committing a crime, relatively speaking, doesn't even exist when you compare it to what Citigroup's doing. Well,
how can $13 trillion alone go missing from the U.S. economy in fraud? $13 trillion, which dwarfs this fraud here. And nobody has faced any time, not even an investigation.
Because the bankers who committed the fraud also own shares in companies like Correction Corps of America, which is a private prison operator that needs new prisoners to turn a profit, so they like it when these people go to jail.
And finally, Max, the biggest insurrectionist against banker occupation out there is gold. And that has been the most troublesome of all the insurrectionists to the global banking cartel. Final headline, Venezuela scrambles to bring home gold reserves. We've been following this. Apparently the 190 tons that Venezuela has asked for back from, mostly from the Bank of England, is on its way. But the propaganda against Hugo Chavez for asking for his gold back is stunning in this, because they're saying it's just the latest in a string of grand gestures and controversial plans by the unpredictable socialist leader. So they're ridiculing him as if this is some ridiculous plan that one should want your own gold in your nation.
Yeah, again, I ask about Germany. They're nervous about their gold. 60% of it's held into the New York banks in America.
That was a big headline in Bild, their biggest tabloid in Germany.
So Germany are having their currency inflated away to nothing because Merkel has drank the Kool-Aid of psychosis, and they don't have most of the gold that they think that they have. Oh boy, hey, let's throw a little match into a tinderbox called German social unrest and see what happens. That should be fun. All right, Stacy Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
Don't go away, much more coming your way, so stay right there. Hi, I'm Max Keiser. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. Time now to go to New York and speak with Leah McGrath-Goodman, former journalist at the Wall Street Journal and author of The Asylum. Renegades, the renegades who hijacked the world's oil market. Leah, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Thanks for having me, Max.
All right, a Bloomberg Businessweek cover on Occupy Wall Street asks, who's behind the mask? You've been down at the Occupy Wall Street, Leah. Tell us what's going on down there. Is there someone behind the mask? Is this legitimate? Is it genuine? What are your impressions?
Well, what I find pretty interesting about this mask question is a lot of it has to do with who's holding the purse strings, and then, of course, who's talking to those holding the purse strings. And it seems right now there's some quiet private funders, and then there are the protesters, and none of them are willing to say that there's a leader. But they have identified some of the funders, and strangely enough, there's a main funder, Robert Halper, who's in The Asylum, the book I wrote. He was one of the oil traders who had been very successful, was an independent oil trader, didn't work for anybody. And he is giving them thousands and thousands of dollars to fund the movement.
Okay, so this gentleman, is he betraying his class?
I don't know if he was ever not for what the protesters are for. He happened to be very lucky. I think he counts himself as someone who, he's also quite intelligent. So he was a very good trader. He did very well. He's retired now. And I think he empathizes with the cause. There are a lot of people, even on Wall Street, there are critical thinkers who think that at this point democracy has been robbed and it has been undermined by money. So there are people who are in the 1% who agree. Warren Buffett would be one of them as well. He publicly agrees anyway. I think behind the scenes he still likes to take advantage of the 1% privileges.
Well, not only that, but he likes to break the law. and he likes to sponsor people who break the law, like Wachovia Bank, part of Wells Fargo, who broke the law egregiously. I mean, he's an insider trader and market manipulator, and this has been well documented. And he pays lip service to his secretary all the time. We know his true love is Charlie Munger, but you know also that he is no way, shape, or form going to do anything to stop the huge social injustice that's ripping the country apart. Is it like a suicide cult, these speculators? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, they're destroying their own country. They'll have no place to go, and they'll probably all go the way of Muammar Gaddafi. So is it some kind of cult that drives them, a cultish thinking?
I would say maybe there's not a physical cult, but there is a methodology to the thought of traders. I don't know if you saw, Occupy Wall Street has a few websites, but one of them actually has a video that was sent widely. It was a trader in London who was basically saying that traders really don't care if there's a solution to the problems that ail us. They don't care if the debt crisis in Europe is solved, and they don't care if the U.S. is swallowed by its own success, because they just want to exploit the opportunities that stem from that. And he was quite brazen about saying it. It shocked the people interviewing him at the TV station in London, and then this video has had millions and millions of hits because it was seen by the Occupy Wall Street crowd as an admission by the traders themselves that there's no interest whatsoever in solving problems but in exploiting the disaster.
Right. A suicide bomber walks into a cafe in Tel Aviv or somewhere else in the world. They don't care who they kill, including themselves, because they're psychotic. Same thing with Lloyd Blankfein, Jamie Dimon. They're psychotic suicide bankers. We saw that on 9/11. But what do you think about this? Obama certainly isn't going after banking crimes, and every Republican candidate is promising to go even easier on these welfare queens on Wall Street. Your thoughts? Is there anything in the pipeline to stop massive welfare giveaways on Wall Street?
I think the protesters have the right idea. You and I were on this program not too long ago, earlier this year, and I said the only thing at this point is people just running into the streets and disrupting. And if you speak with some of the more movement-building type protesters, as opposed to what the protesters amongst themselves call the tourists, they will talk about the art of disruption, the art of strategic civil disobedience. They're studying it. They have training sessions every day down on Wall Street, how to do this properly without having fingers pointed at them as being violent.
Okay, so they're upping up their game in terms of financial warfare to fight back against the speculators and searching for economies of scale, searching for leverage, searching for ways to push back. So far, nothing has really worked out. Let me ask you about the invention of the modern derivatives contract, because in your book, The Asylum, which talks about the birth of the modern oil trading platforms, derivatives and how that evolved were a huge part of the story. So just to give viewers a bit of a background here, can you just describe how the derivatives came into being in the oil futures market and how that changed that market substantially?
Oh, well, in the oil market and the energy market in general, it was right here in Manhattan that traders first decided they were going to try to trade oil when Reagan lifted restrictions allowing oil and heating oil, crude oil, and gas, and that would be gasoline, and then as well as natural gas. All these things were now allowed to freely be traded, not be regulated at fixed prices. So when that happened, it freed up the market to trade in a way it never had been able to before. It was like letting the dollar float after the gold standard was lifted. And that introduced these derivatives. In my book, I talk about the traders who first put these together. And then, of course, the Koch brothers further developed the over-the-counter products, as you mentioned. And those derivatives were even more complex and exotic. They were not standardized futures contracts, which are also derivatives. They were tailored bets between two parties. So they call it bilateral, parties. It'd be you and I might enter a private agreement, and it's therefore unregulated. We're sophisticated players. Nobody's allowed in our business. We're not trading on an exchange. It's all over the counter, which is off market.
To follow up on the Koch brothers, we know that they were involved in funding and creating some oil derivatives. And now they're involved in funding the Tea Party. So it's an interesting storyline there with the Koch brothers. They seem to be able to manipulate politics and markets simultaneously. Is anyone on their level in terms of manipulating both politics and markets?
Well, I'll tell you something. I met with the head of M&A for Goldman Sachs, told me, he said, if you really want to look at something, you should look at the Koch brothers, because the things that they are doing are beyond description. And when someone that high up at Goldman says that, I assume that he might know what he's talking about. The Koch brothers, they're very, very secretive. And recently, they pulled out of Cushing, Oklahoma, where all the oil is kept in the United States. They actually just got rid of all their assets, or they at least don't have a name in there anymore. I'm assuming they're leasing space so that they don't have to be associated with the game. But I'm pretty sure they're still in there. They just don't want anyone to know about it. And they like to do everything very privately. So funding the Tea Party movement, this group, Americans for Prosperity, that is one of the main funding vehicles, and they named it that because it sounds very innocent. And of course, we all agree with Americans for Prosperity. That sounds very, very good to all of us. So they're very clever about it. They're really serious libertarians. They really believe that they are leading the way.
Right, libertarians, by their definition, of course, means financial terrorism. It's not true libertarianism.
Yes.
Okay, now, I read somewhere that for every barrel of oil that people actually use in business, there are about 60,000 barrels of oil traded as represented by various derivatives of oil around the world. So the enormous abstraction of that market and leverage and control by the people who feed into the derivatives market, the people who lend money to the derivative terrorists, like the JP Morgans and the Goldman Sachs, they have a market that is not only destroying people's access to energy, but also destroying the global market as a whole. But I want to move on to another big market that you cover, and that are the water derivatives. So after the oil derivatives, now we've got water derivatives. What are they? Where is the market? Who's the biggest player?
Well, who's the biggest player? That's tough. I think that the market itself is still maturing. There are some very big hedge funds that have emerged. I think the most respectable one, and I think the most capitalized one, is called Summit Global in San Diego. And they've been at it since 1999. They have about 500 million, I believe, under management. Water's still seen as a pretty tricky market because it's so heavily regulated. It is the last big market in the United States that is not deregulated. So it is not something where you have a ton of players coming in.
All right, so in other words, the goal for those who are bringing in the water derivatives trading market is to go the route of the oil market. So for every gallon of water consumed to keep life afloat on this planet, there'll be 60,000 gallons manipulated in the futures market, making a few people rich, who then will be able to afford to buy water to keep alive, and everyone else will, of course, die. But I guess, again, it gets back to that suicide mentality of the speculator on Wall Street and that kind of cultist Jim Jones Guyana Kool-Aid mentality that is destroying the American economy, but making a few people very wealthy. Now, Leah McGrath Goodman, do you have any final thoughts on the Occupy Wall Street and the state of financial markets and the fraud that is now running the entire American economy? How do you see this changing in any way, or is it pretty well just doomed?
Well, I want to leave you with two thoughts. And the first one is on the water. Most speculators don't believe that water should be speculated on because they understand the dangers inherent in what could happen as that market matures. I don't think right now we're looking at a situation where water could be hoarded and where the prices could be jacked up the same way with oil. But there's a fear that that could happen further along the way.
Well, let me just cut in for a second. Let me cut in for a second. I mean, we've got the example of Bolivia and Bechtel, who privatized rainwater, and people died because Bechtel, a U.S. conglomeration with affiliates on Wall Street, decided that water, they own the rainwater. So we know the mentality of the psychopath on Wall Street and the American businessman is to rape and pillage. That we know. So water is clearly an untapped market. So what's to stop them? You're saying that they're not gonna do this because why? Again, I don't get that. What's gonna stop them? There's no regulation, there's no morality, there's no ethics. It's just a pure wholesale destruction.
I absolutely don't disagree with you. What I meant in what I was saying was that the traders themselves fear speculation in water. I don't think we've seen the full extent, because it's not deregulated, of what can be achieved in terms of dangers inherent in trading water. But they themselves fear the results of that. While there are very responsible traders, Summit Global, by the way, I consider them very ethical in the way they handle it, but there are many others that are looking to exploit, and that is a fear, and that is why this industry remains regulated, and probably will for as long as money is not chiseling our regulation out again. But that could happen.
Right. Well, yeah, as far as water becoming a dangerous market, every heroin addict fears that hot shot that's going to kill them, but they don't stop shooting heroin, do they? These speculators are not going to stop until somebody stops them for them. All right, well, anyway, Leah McGrath Goodman, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thanks for having me. Take care, Max.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank my guest, Leah McGrath Goodman. She's the author of The Asylum, The Renegades Who Hijacked the World's Oil Market. You can tweet us at Keiser Report or visit our Facebook page at facebook.com Keiser Report. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.